It only takes about 2.5 hours for the ship to sink. There were only enough lifeboats for about half of the people. However, these lifeboats were not filled all the way. Sadly, only about 700 people survived. Now here we are more than 100 years later, and this is still the most famous ship in history. The Titanic was referred to as an Olympic-class liner. There were 3 of them, sometimes referred to as sister ships. The Titanic sunk because of an iceberg, and then the Britannic sunk after hitting a mine in World War I. The Olympic, however, had a fairly successful career of about 24 years. All 3 sister ships were almost identical. Just a few details were changed on the inside. When they finished building the Titanic, it was the largest ship in the world, being only a little bit heavier than the Olympic. The ship was 269 meters long. But to put this in perspective, here's a comparison to the world's largest cruise ship today. Let's look at some of the details on the outside of the ship. The front of the ship is called the bow. The back of the ship is called the stern. Then, instead of using left and right, they use port and starboard. Now, these are general sailing terms that are still in use today, not just for the Titanic. On the ship, we have 4 funnels. Coal is burned down below, and the smoke comes up the funnels. Only 3 of the funnels are used. The 4th one was added mainly for looks. The builders thought it might appear more powerful with a 4th one. However, this 4th funnel is still helpful for ventilation down below. These 2 large poles are what they call the mast. It was used as supports for the radio antennas and also to carry the flags. Towards the front of the ship, you can see the crow's nest. This is where the lookout spotted the iceberg only a little bit too late. The area in the front is called the forecastle deck. You can see the massive chains that attach to the anchors at the very front. Going to the back of the ship, this area is called the poop deck. And no, this has nothing to do with bodily functions. It originated from the Latin word puppus, which literally means stern of the ship. So there you go, poop deck. I'm still getting used to the name, but that's what they called it. This raised part is called the docking bridge. It was used by the crew to help guide the ship into the harbor. The Titanic also had several electric cargo cranes to help with loading and unloading at the docks. There's also more cranes at the front of the ship. The Titanic had 3 massive propellers underneath the water. For comparison, here's the size of a person. The propellers are powered by the ship's massive engines. We'll learn about how these work later in the video. This is the rudder used to steer the ship. The ship was designed and built over 100 years ago. That means no computers, no 3D design software. This was all designed by hand. To me, that's incredible engineering and craftsmanship. The Titanic had 10 decks inside. The very top deck is called the boat deck. Then below, they labeled the decks with the letters A through G. But each of these decks also had another name, so you could call it A deck or promenade deck, B deck or bridge deck, and so on. Then for the bottom 2, we have the orlop deck and the tank top. This area has a lot of the ship's engines and machinery. Passengers are not allowed down here. Let's see this from another point of view. Let's get the ship right down the middle and see what this looks like. A few things to point out. The first 3 funnels, you can see how they are connected down below to the boilers. They take the smoke and give it a place to go. Then, just like we talked about earlier, that 4th funnel isn't really needed. However, it still provided some ventilation to the decks below. The first-class passengers had 2 sets of stairs, the forward grand staircase and the aft grand staircase. The forward grand staircase went all the way down to E deck. Directly in front of it is the 3 elevators. Then we have the aft grand staircase over here, which doesn't go down quite as far, only down to C deck. Then here we have the staircases for the 2nd class passengers. And then the staircase for the 3rd class passengers in the very back of the ship. This was all close to the steering machinery. This is why 3rd class was sometimes referred to as steerage passengers. So cabins for the 3rd class passengers are here towards the lower decks, and here's where the 2nd class passengers are. and the first-class passengers got to stay on the highest decks and have some of the best views. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the layout of the ship. Now let's go through each deck, starting with the boat deck. It gets its name because this is the deck where the lifeboats were stored. They split the deck space into several different areas. As a second-class passenger, the view of the ocean would be blocked by these lifeboats. For the first-class passengers, most of the deck doesn't have lifeboats. The builders wanted to make sure that the first-class passengers had the best view possible. This was one of the reasons why the Titanic didn't have enough lifeboats. So the ship had 20 lifeboats in total, enough for about half of the people on board. The idea at the time was that the Titanic was unsinkable. If an accident happened, these lifeboats would only be needed to ferry passengers and crew over to a rescue ship. As we all know, not having enough lifeboats was a very bad idea. Each lifeboat is hanging on what's called a davit. If and when it's time to launch the lifeboat, the davit is swung out. Fill the boat with passengers and then lower it into the water. Up towards the front of the boat is the bridge. This is the control center for the ship. This area is the wheelhouse, which is a good place to warm up on a cold night. There are 2 wheels to control the ship's rudder, and then this is the engine order telegraph. They use these to communicate directly with the engine room. The bridge officer rotates the handle to whatever speed they want to go, and then the engineer moves his handle to confirm that they got the order. Behind this area is where some of the crew would sleep so they could be close to the bridge. This is the captain's quarters, some of the officers' quarters, and an officer's smoke room. This is the Marconi wireless room. This is where they use Morse code to communicate with other ships in the area. Here's some rooms for just a few of the first-class passengers. Here's the oh-so-famous grand staircase. It has skylights up above to let in natural light during the day. This is the gymnasium, with various pieces of equipment to exercise. Here's the officer's mess, and the engineer's smoke room. At the very back is the second-class entrance, which leads down below. So that's the boat deck, the very top deck on the Titanic. Underneath is A deck, also known as the promenade deck. Plenty of covered areas to walk around the edge of the ship, with amazing views towards the ocean. There are first-class rooms at the very front, ladies' lavatory here, and gentlemen's lavatory here. The grand staircase, and of course some exits to get out onto the promenade. Here's the first-class reading and writing room, and the first-class lounge. The aft grand staircase, 2 more first-class rooms, and then the first-class smoke room. This is where the men would gather after dinner time. The last is the veranda cafe and palm court, which served refreshments for the first-class passengers. This is B deck, also known as the bridge deck. Towards the front of the ship, we have the forecastle deck. We saw this earlier in the video. And then this is the center section. Most of this is taken up by first-class rooms. Plenty of access to the gentlemen's and ladies' lavatories. Some of the first-class rooms actually have their own dedicated bathrooms. These are the parlor suites, each with a private promenade. It's about as nice as you could get on board the Titanic. This is the first-class boarding entrance. At the dock, this is where the first-class passengers would come aboard the ship. Here's the elevators, and both the forward and aft grand staircase. This is the galley, pantry, and general areas to prepare food. The a la carte restaurant, and the Café Parisien. These were luxury dining options for the first class. This back area here is for the second class passengers. Stairways here, and then the second class smoke room. And as part of the B deck, you have the poop deck in the very back. This was used as the third class promenade. That means we have the first class promenade, second class promenade, and then the third class promenade. That way everyone had access to the decks up above. Okay, C deck, also known as the shelter deck. This is the highest deck to go continuously from the front of the ship all the way to the back. Starting at the very front, we have some areas where some of the crew members would eat their meals. Then the open deck right here, they called this the well deck. And most of the space here is taken up by first class rooms. The lavatories are here, and there's even a barber shop here. This is the maids and valets saloon. It's where servants of first class passengers ate. The second class stairs here, and the second class library here. Then we have the other well deck, and the third class smoke room, the third class general room, and then the third class stairs which lead to the decks down below. In the very back, this holds the steering gear, and then the 2 steering engines. These engines were used to move the gear, which then rotates the ship's rudder directly below. The steering engines are controlled by the wheels that we saw earlier on the bridge. On occasion, they can also use a third wheel on the docking bridge up above. So that was C deck. Now let's move on down below to D deck, also known as the saloon deck. Up at the front, you have the rooms for the firemen. These men worked with the boilers at the very bottom of the ship. This is the firemen's stairs. These extend all the way to the bottom of the ship. The third class covered promenade, lots of walking space here. More first class rooms. Another first class entrance onto the ship. First class reception room. And the first class dining saloon. There were some fancy meals served around here. This area is where a lot of the food was stored and prepared. This is the hospital with a few rooms for sick patients. Second class dining saloon, second class rooms, and third class rooms in the very back. Now let's move on to E deck, also known as the upper deck. This had a lot more rooms for crew members, including engineers, cooks, stewards, waiters, seamen, and trimmers. This is called the crew alleyway, or another name was the Scotland Road. It was kind of the main corridor that crew members could use. Here's the third class entrance onto the ship, third class rooms, and the third class lavatory. More first class rooms on this side of the ship. And the E deck was the lowest deck that you could take the grand staircase and also for the elevators. Second class rooms here, and third class rooms here. Notice how this deck is low enough that we're starting to see the ship's engines. This is F deck, also known as the middle deck. More crew members sleep up front here. Here's third class rooms, the swimming pool. Titanic was one of the first ocean liners to offer a swimming pool. This is the Turkish bath, which provided luxury bath services for first class passengers. Third class dining saloon, third class pantry, galley, and other areas to prepare food. More rooms for crew members, second class rooms here, and third class rooms here. This is G deck, also known as the lower deck. This is the last deck that is above the waterline, and the last deck to have rooms for passengers and crew. Here's rooms for crew members, some third class rooms, post office, first class baggage, and this is the squash racket court. It's a game similar to racquetball. Now we're starting to see more of the ship's machinery. I'll explain this once we get down below to the bottom deck. The saloons, restaurant, and cafes stored food down here, so things like fruits, vegetables, meat, flour, and milk. At the very back is more room for third-class passengers. This is the orlop deck. Notice how it only has deck space in the very front and very back of the ship. Lots of room to store cargo at the front. First to second-class baggage here, and the mail room is here. Again, more space for machinery here and the engines. Refrigerated cargo and other food at the back. And a tiny space here for even more cargo. Lots of cargo, alright. This is the tank top, the lowest level on the Titanic. At the front of the ship is carnival rides for the kids. Just kidding. There's more cargo here. Perfect space for this kind of thing. The fireman's stairs lead all the way down here. This is the fireman's passage. It allowed direct access over to the boiler rooms. Okay, this is where things start to get exciting. The boilers. These burn coal to then generate steam for the ship's engines. The Titanic has 6 boiler rooms. So boiler room 1, boiler room 2, and then 3, 4, 5, and 6. 29 boilers in total. Boiler room 1 has 5 single-ended boilers. This means you can only put coal into one side of the boiler. Boiler room 2 through 6 has double-ended boilers, so coal can go into both sides of the boiler. Coal bunkers are placed between each boiler room, so these were filled with coal before they left for their journey. Working in the boiler rooms was very difficult. It was hot and humid, and work was extremely tiring. The firemen were the crew members who had the job of keeping these boilers fed with coal. Let's take a look inside one of these boilers. The coal goes in through here, and the fire will heat the water, which will generate steam. This will also produce smoke that travels through the smoke tubes, and then up through the boiler exhaust uptakes, which then goes to one of the first 3 of the funnels. The steam that gets produced will travel through the pipes towards the back of the ship. It takes as much as 24 hours to start producing steam, so they have to start preparing long before the ship will leave the harbor. This steam makes it all the way to the engine room. Inside of this room are 2 reciprocating steam engines. These engines were 3 stories tall. Even by today's standards, that's enormous. Inside of each engine, there are 4 cylinders. Inside of each cylinder is a piston. The steam comes in and pushes the piston up and then down. This happens over and over. All 4 cylinders working together turn the shaft down below. Each shaft goes out through the back of the ship and connects to the propellers. Don't forget, there's a 3rd propeller blade out the middle, but this one is powered by a different engine. Leftover steam from the reciprocating engines goes to the next room, which has the low-pressure turbine engine. The steam is used to turn the center shaft, which then turns the 3rd propeller blade out the back. So the outside propeller blades are powered by the reciprocating steam engines, and the center propeller is powered by the low-pressure turbine engine. The leftover steam from the turbine engine goes to the condensers. This turns the steam into water again, where it can then be recycled back to the boilers. Fresh water was stored in large tanks here. This could be used as drinking water throughout the ship. This is the electric engine room. There are 4 electric engines that use steam to make electricity for the entire ship. There were also 2 backup engines behind here. On the night the Titanic sank, this area of the ship didn't take on water until the very end. The electricians kept these motors running as long as possible to keep the lights on. They were heroes. The Titanic had a system of 15 watertight bulkheads, which made 16 watertight compartments. If the ship was damaged and water started filling one of these compartments, it shouldn't spill over into any of the others. Or at least that's the idea. The watertight bulkheads separate the lower decks on the Titanic. For example, there are watertight bulkheads between every coal bunker. But the crew members need to be able to get through these bulkheads. That's why they used watertight doors. Normally they remained open, but in an emergency they could be closed in just a few seconds. These watertight compartments were originally said to have made the ship unsinkable. When the Titanic hit the iceberg, it scraped along the starboard side of the ship. Many of the forward compartments started flooding. It proved to be too much, and the Titanic was doomed to sink.